I know we have a lot to go through, especially since we haven't met for quite some time. So we will call to order the Land Management Committee of the Flood Diversion Authority to order September 26th, or excuse me, December 19th, 2018. We haven't met for a while, but we do have an agenda. Is there any additions to the agenda that anyone would care to add or changes? If
Motion
not,
to approve.
thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And on to the minutes of September 26th. If somebody can approve those, it'd be great.
Move approval.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any additions or corrections? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. And moving right along, item number 4, the flowage easement study update. Eric?
I'm going to go to the podium. Thanks for the time today to present this. As you know, we've been working on the Phase 1 flowage easement study for most of the year, and Brian Field and Jeff Berg are here from Crown Appraisals today, so if you haven't met them, welcome to Brian and Jeff. Thanks for coming. And I believe one of their other teammates may be on the phone, Tim Hodge, is from Michigan. So if Tim's on, he'll be joining us for Q&A session in a little bit. I'm going to go through the first handful of slides here and then turn things over to Jeff and Brian, and they're going to cover some of the meat of the study. And then there's a few points at the back end that I wanted to come back and cover after that. So feel free to ask any questions as we go along. I think some of you maybe have been involved in review of the draft report. We did get the final report from Crown about a week ago, not too long ago anyway, and so our intention is to be posting that report out on the project website, but wanted to make sure we were making a presentation to at least this committee before we did so. So in terms of the presentation, we have just a project overview, which I think most everybody in this group is familiar with, of course. The project has some impacts, and we have certain approaches to mitigate those impacts. We have been doing ag mitigation planning for quite some time, and so we wanted to just touch on that, get into the meat of what we found with the flowage easement study, and talk a bit about next steps. So again, the project, for this group here, I guess no surprises. I was anticipating there may be a few less familiar folks in the crowd, but obviously the project includes the diversion channel, in-town levees, the southern embankment with gated control structures, and the upstream mitigation area, which is for temporary storage of floodwaters so that we don't have downstream impacts. Before and after, on the left side, floodplain, 100-year floodplain without the project, and on the right side, the 100-year floodplain with the project. You can see down on the south end, south of the embankment, that is the area that will be impacted, and that's the focus of the mitigation area for upstream impacts. So because the project operation requires that temporary storage of floodwaters, we are required to make payment to the property owner for the purchase of property rights. And those property rights have been assumed to be a flowage easement. And so there's been long-standing questions about what is the value of a flowage easement, and we've been working on that for a number of years, most recently with the efforts that Crown Appraisals has worked on. Keep in mind that the flowage easement is one of several mitigation measures that the Diversion Authority has developed, along with a supplemental crop loss program for summer floods, debris cleanup program, and a dispute resolution board. All of these are identified and spelled out in more detail within the mitigation plan that the project has. The map there shows depth difference. This is a map actually from the DNR's supplemental EIS. So that map shows the depth difference with Plan B. This map shows the duration difference, again, with Plan B. And I should probably point out that, of course, we are waiting final permit decision. And so this phase 1 study has been ongoing, parallel tracking with the with the permit review and the environmental review that the state of Minnesota is working on. Subsequently, we will likely get into a future phase of flow easement study. From an ag mitigation planning standpoint, this has been going on for quite some time. The Corps' FEIS, or Federal Feasibility Study and Environmental Impact Statement, had identified the impacts from the project, and they had assumed a budgetary value for flowage easements back when that report was published in 2011. When the Diversion Authority was formed, shortly thereafter, an ag policy subcommittee was established to help discuss ag impacts and really collaborate with producers and the like. We've had a handful of meetings over the course of the many years. Watson Associates was retained as an expert on ag mitigation, specifically related to crop insurance. We had years ago hired another appraisal firm to do a sample flowage easement appraisal, Tingeman Associates. They've actually done flowage easement valuations for the Wahpeton project. The Corps of Engineers turned us on to a gentleman named Steve Herzog, who provided some thoughts and guidance on appraisal procedures. And all of this is related to how are we going to mitigate the impacts on ag land. In addition, the Diversion Authority did retain the NDSU Ag Econ Department to study ag impacts. Subsequently, the state of North Dakota, by the Water Commission, also retained NDSU to expand on that initial study. And then back about a year ago, the Diversion Authority recognized that we needed to make more progress on the value of flowage easements. And so the Diversion Authority issued an RFP. Crown Appraisals was one of the 4 or 5 firms that had submitted a proposal. We reviewed all those proposals and thought Crown's approach was really spot on for what we wanted to accomplish. And so retained Crown Appraisals. I keep calling you guys engineers, I apologize. They get a bad enough name, yeah. Anyway, retained Crown Appraisals and really focused on phase 1 because the project uncertainties at the time, we didn't know exactly how the governor's task force was going to unfold and the review process that the state of Minnesota was working towards. So again, that was parallel tracked. All along, we've expected there would be continual efforts, more future efforts along with this. And so what you'll see here today is very foundational, really important, good foundational work, but it's not the end of our mitigation approach for ag impacts. So this was started in January. The Crown team here locally, I guess originally headquarters out of Barnesville, recently moved into Fargo. They paired up with a couple experts from across the country that they've worked with elsewhere. Really tried to focus on researching comparable sales that may have had a flood impact and building a regression model to analyze how the market has valued flood impacts over time. And so in addition to that, the results of this phase 1 effort are really going to, again, be foundational for next steps as we move towards a subsequent, I guess we're calling it phase 2. The phase 1 report, as you'll hear in just a bit more detail here shortly, involved not only the regression analysis, but also a paired sales analysis. And I'll probably leave it to these guys to explain exactly what that means. Again, I wanted to hit on this early, just early and maybe often, because I want people to recognize that while phase 1 was very beneficial in that we proved there's market data available, we proved that we're going to compensate property owners, properly based on that market data, but there's more work to be done. All of this work for phase 1 is sort of a research-driven effort and not specific to Plan B as we know it. And so phase 2, the intention is to, if we get a permit decision from the state of Minnesota, all this is sort of prefaced on that. And then we'll apply the findings from the phase 1 study, incorporate the final project configuration as well as hydraulic modeling. There's a FEMA has to approve the hydraulic modeling. NDSU has done their ag study, as you're aware, but that was based on previous versions of the project, and so the NDSU ag study would likely need to be updated. And then ultimately, Phase 2 would produce a flowage easement compensation for the non-developed acres in the mitigation area. And that'll be done with what we call it a before and after evaluation. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Jeff and/or Brian and ask them to go through some more of the details on their work.
Thank you, Eric. I'm Jeff Berg, owner of Crown Appraisals. I'll make a few introductory comments, and then I'll turn it over to the really smart guy, Brian Field, to fill you in on all of the details. Way back 1,000 years ago when this project got started, I looked at all of these acres, 30 or 40,000 acres that were going to be impacted by it was first called the pool area, then the staging area. Now I think there's a different name for it, the mitigation area. And thought, this would be a great project for a very large regression analysis, a hedonic regression analysis. And I know just the guy that could help us out with this. And Brian will talk about Tim Hodge, but he's a key part of our team. And then it just happens that Doug Hodge, who is Tim's dad, and I have known each other for a long time, and he works extensively in before and after appraisals. Does a lot of rails to trails, a lot of drainage, a lot of high line, transmission line appraisals, that type of thing. And I coupled that up with the experience that I have gained over the years. I was part of the group of appraisers that worked up in East Grand Forks and Grand Forks when that drainage project went in, and I also did a bunch of appraisal work down in Breckenridge when they did their version of a drainage project or bypass. So that just gives you a little bit of history about me. I'm going to step aside now and let Brian speak and take you through the details of this. And so let's welcome Brian Field.
Okay, thank you. Just want to give you a little bit of background on what our process was and why we selected the various factors that we did. I want to make certain that everybody understands that there's two separate issues that we were looking at. The first thing we were looking at was what is the value of the rights that will be taken with the flowage easement. And then the second thing, in addition to that, we have in the after condition, now we have a greater frequency, more propensity to flooding. How does that change the land value? So these are two separate things. We want to make sure that we keep them separate in everybody's minds. And of course, if you have questions as we go through this, please ask. So to begin, the first thing we wanted to do was determine research areas, find out where are these studies, where are these sales located. So we cast a pretty wide net. Fortunately, Jeff and Doug and I are all very highly involved in appraisal organization, the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. So we know lots of people throughout the country who specialize in things like this. We asked a lot of people. Everybody said, I don't know. But through asking enough people, we finally were able to locate some good study areas for the flowage easement portion of the project. So here we initially looked in the immediate area here in the Red River Valley to build this regression analysis, which will be part of the frequency of flooding issues. We assembled sales from 1992 all the way up through, it was early 2018 when we started on this study. So that's about when the sales end. We checked in the six county area here of the southern end of the valley, and in order to have land that is most similar to each other, we tried to stay within roughly 15 miles of the river on either side. To 2 or 3 townships away from the river was our study area. From 1992 to today, we were able to come up with approximately 2,100 arm's length sales transactions, which is it's a tremendous amount of information. Jeff has a sample page here that shows, it's just one example of one particular year. I think it's 1997 is the year there. It just shows you, gives you an idea of the factors that we were tracking, soil quality, shape, things like that. There's a bunch of different factors on there. You can take a look. But those are the things we were looking at and seeing how do each of these things impact the value. And then we took all of those sales. You'll see the map that has all the red dots on it. Those are good sales that were utilized in our analysis. And when we were all done, and Tim, who is our econometrician, and he doesn't want to be called a statistician, we learned that one of these earlier meetings, but he's an econometrician. He cleaned all the data, and this is what he came up with. So what you're seeing on that map is the outline or the footprint of the 1997 flood and where the sales are located in relation to that. So you can see that the whole south end of the valley is just peppered with sales there. Gives us a lot of great information to analyze and draw conclusions. And one of the things we learned from Tim is that the more sales information we have, the better, and the more statistically valid the information becomes. So we're going to use this information to reflect the market conditions, to establish compensation for the mitigation impacts, being both the flowage easement and then later and the damages as well. Any questions on why I know there was some questions before on why we selected the areas that we did. The main thing being that it is all very similar quality land, and that was the goal. So we wanted to take out any of those variables by having land outside the area. Once you get outside the valley in Cass and Clay County and the other counties around, the quality of land can vary quite a bit there. So moving on here, the temporary flooding, we separated it into 2 groups, as I mentioned before. The first group being the easement. So what is actually being taken, what rights are being purchased in the proposed flowage easement. There will be development rights taken, and it's not necessarily the ability to develop into a subdivision, or that couldn't be done, but it's anything building a farmstead or a rural residence, anything along those lines will not be allowed in what will be deemed the floodway. There will be areas that development is still allowed but restricted in the floodplain. But then the other right that's being taken is the right to not be flooded and the right to prevent that your property from being flooded, which is very important. So, well, to jump ahead here on this slide, the next thing it talks about is temporary flood impact, and that is the second box. That is the damages, as is a common term for those issues. Damages being the change in market value. Okay, now we have this easement. We paid for the easement. The easement is in place on the property. Now, if I'm to sell that property, what is it worth compared to land that doesn't have the propensity to flood, like will be the case after the diversion is constructed. And it's important to note that not all parcels will be impacted the same. And you can see on the graphic on the right side, that's why we have concluded ranges. No 2 properties are alike. Yeah, we have a lot of square quarters that are very, very similar, but no 2 properties will be affected exactly the same. So we concluded ranges in our study here, and we will apply those in phase 2. So the impact of the easement. So as we were calling around to all these different places around the country trying to find this information on where there are flowage easements on, or similar type of flowage easements. We were able to zero in on one particular area in southeast Missouri, kind of in the Boot Heel area there where the Mississippi River runs. You can see on the graphic on the bottom right, in the very bottom right corner of that, the yellow shaded area, that's the area where we focused our study. It's an area termed the Birds Point New Madrid floodway. It's an area along the Mississippi River that way back in the 1930s and 40s, the Corps of Engineers constructed a large levee along the Mississippi River to prevent flooding in the lowlands in that area. Well, so they had purchased flowage easements at that time, and these easements had been in place for many, many years. Jump ahead to 2011, we have a tremendous amount of water that's coming down the Mississippi drainage and the Missouri River drainage, and it's creating a lot of issues. And there is a city right across from that yellow shaded area in Illinois, town of Cairo, Illinois, that was in severe danger of being basically a catastrophic loss. So the Corps went in and blew the diversion, or the levee. They blew the levee, a big hole in it, and flooded all of that low-lying land in the shaded area where they had flowage easements. It was very, very interesting because they had never done that for 70 years, 70, 80 years approximately, where it had never been utilized. People may or may not have been aware that there was an easement on their property. And even still, if they were aware, it had never been utilized, and their grandpa had sold the easement to somebody, and they just basically had forgotten about it. And the market had forgotten about it. So there was very little difference in the sales of land that had an easement on it versus land that did not. But in 2011 comes along, and the levee gets blown, and all of a sudden, what we term in our report is as the aha moment, like, oh crap, this can really happen kind of deal. That was created in 2011, and what happened, there was very few sales in 2011, which, even though it doesn't give us sale data, what it does show that the market basically seized from that event. It stopped because nobody knew how to handle it. What is this land worth going forward? Nobody was certain. In 2011, 12, 13, 14, we were able to see that land with those flowage easements in place all of a sudden went from selling at a very similar level or even maybe a slight premium because it's river bottom ground compared to land without easements. Now all of a sudden it's selling for 5, 10, 20, 30% less. So that is what we utilized to hone in on what we deemed the value of those rights and the value of a flowage easement on that property. There was numerous pairings. I don't recall exactly how many pairings. We have a map of that, a more specific map of the New Madrid area. That's already gone around. Okay, so you can kind of see where we're looking at. We did our very best to select the best pairs. We did a matched pairs or paired sales analysis in that area where we're comparing a piece of property that has a flowage easement versus a piece of property that doesn't. What's the difference? Is it 10%, 5%? What is it? And then we aggregated all that information. And what we came up with, what we concluded, is that there is a value reduction of approximately 8 to 10% for that flowage easement. Now that doesn't include anything for damages or potentially increased flood risk going forward. But that's what we hung our hat on for strictly the flowage easement, for purchasing those rights. Are there any questions on that specific portion of the study? And Jeff, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I would just mention that you've got two separate pieces, as Brian is describing. You have the value of the flowage easement, whatever that is, that's one number. And that takes away a certain set of sticks out of the bundle of rights. And then you have land that's going to be flooded that doesn't normally flood, to the extent that it's going to be flooded. And so those are damages, that's a different set of numbers. And so you add those two numbers together, those values, and that gets you to your total damages on any given piece of property. That's what we'll be doing in phase 2, is looking at individual properties.
Okay. So the next portion of our study was determining, okay, now we have this ground that it may have flooded in the past, but now the frequency of flooding is higher. There's a greater chance of being flooded on any given year with the diversion channel in place. So we had to look at, what does land that floods frequently or is flood prone, what does that sell for in relation to land that does not? So here is where that regression study came in, and those 1,600 plus sales over a 27-year period, where Tim took all this information and all these factors that were on that spreadsheet that went around earlier, and he put that all into his model that he built. And I don't know if Tim is on the line now to explain some of it, but basically we aggregated. He's not. Okay. Okay. Well, so we aggregated all that information, and that showed us that historically there has been a difference of 7 to 10% for land that floods, that gets hit by these floods. More often it sells for roughly 7 to 10% less than land that does not flood often. Anything on the regression? Anything else you wanted to add?
The regression is a really strong tool for looking at the impact of a flooding event on a piece of property. And these properties, we sent this sheet around from our database. If we had the names of the buyers and sellers on here, and this list goes on for pages and pages, 1,600 plus, you would recognize the names of a lot of the buyers and sellers. A lot of these sales were in our database that I've been collecting for 30 years in the appraisal business. Brian always gave me a bad time for years and years. Why don't you throw out all of that old junk? I said, we're going to need it someday. And so now we needed it, and I was really glad that we had it. So we put that together with a bunch of other information. But the bottom line is that when a flood event comes along, on ground that doesn't typically flood, like a 97 flood, or an 09 flood, an 06 flood, there is a period of time for a couple of years after that event where the value of that land goes down. And we identified 7 to 10% right here on the southern end of the river valley. And so this data doesn't get any better than this. And from a statistical perspective, having this number of sales really gives you strong conclusions. And so this phase 1 or regression analysis was key and very instrumental in coming up with a 7 to 10% reduction due to an increased flooding, the number of flooding events here on the southern end of the river valley.
The next thing that we did is we wanted to look at this from a different lens. So we utilized the matched pairs or the paired sales analysis, similar to what we had done in Missouri, but we went and looked at the north end of the Red River Valley, so north of Grand Forks, between Grand Forks and the Canadian border. And Jeff will pass around some maps of the areas that we looked at. The reason why we looked in those areas is because it's great to have information along the same river that faces a lot of the same issues as we do down in this region. But these pieces of land between I-29 and the river and approximately Highway 75 and the river on the Minnesota side, they tend to flood even more frequently than land in the south end of the valley. Because as the Red River flows north, on average, it drops, from what we have read, it drops about 5 inches per length of river mile, or per river mile. But when you get north of Grand Forks and as you approach Canada, that gets even less. It goes down to 1.5 inches per mile, which is almost flat. And so the water tends to spread out there more frequently, more commonly. So we wanted to look in that area because in the after condition down in this end, we will have a greater frequency of flooding. So what we did is analyzed a couple dozen sales from either side of the river. We tried to pick the very best pairs that we could, again looking at a piece that is flood prone versus one that is not, and what's the difference in sale price. And from that, we were able to identify that flood risk for the land that typically floods greater, it sells at an 11 to 36% diminution, or 11 to 36% less than land that does not typically flood. So we have our two studies now, and we wanted to marry the two sets of data. From our regression analysis on the south end of the valley, we concluded 7 and 10%. Our paired sales analysis on the north end of the valley, we concluded 11 to 36%. So we sat down, Tim and Doug flew in, and we had them in our office here in Fargo for 2 days. We went over all this information, and after picking the very best pairs and trying to reconcile what we had found, we reconciled that the impact due to increased flood risk should be approximately 7 to 25%. So how do we apply that information? We have the two boxes like we've been talking here. So we have the loss of our property rights, which is determined in Missouri, of 8 to 10%. That's for taking those rights in the flowage easement. But for increasing the flood risk, now you add that on. So you add on another 7 to 25%, which was calculated here locally. So in total, we have a diminution in value to be paid to landowners of 15 to 35%. Now it's a 20% spread, obviously, but as we talked about, no two properties are the same. Some will really be affected by this the closer you get to the river and north along the embankment, versus something that's very much in the southwest that might not be impacted every single year. So that's why we wanted to conclude a range. But going forward in phase 2, we will be using this information and selecting numbers from this range.
Are there any questions on any of this? Either the property right that is being taken or the damages that are being calculated? If you want to talk to us one-on-one after the meeting, you're welcome to do that.
I have a question. I guess I'll raise my hand for myself here. When you get into phase 2, I mean, this is really impressive, I think, this phase 1 is, I like it. But when you get into phase 2, is there any controversy here? I mean, how sure are you of your elevations and your numbers and your soil types, and when you get into individual land parcels?
Okay, that's a really good question.
Oh, the truth on me.
That is a really, really good question, Mary. There is a hydraulic study being done by Houston Engineering. They are going to look at, they've got all of the elevations of the property, and they are going to look at what happens during various severities of flood events. How far back does it flow toward the south, or how far does it back up? How deep does it get? And then how far does it spread out to the sides, to the east and west, mostly to the west? And what is the depth going to be? And as you know, the Red River Valley slopes gently toward the Red River. And so as you start flooding next to the river, it's going to get deeper, and then it'll be shallower and shallower and shallower out further west. And the modeling that is being done is we're going to tie that into our regression analysis so that on every piece of ground, we're going to be able to know the depth and the duration, how long, and the frequency of the flooding based on the assumptions that are going to be used in that study. And so based on all of that information, we're going to be able to look at how deep the water will be for how long on each piece of ground. And we're not going to dig into it today here, but there is a variable in there that says that the deeper it is flooded, which means that the longer it's flooded, the more severe the damages are. Hence that range that Brian just pointed out. The land that is flooded deeper and longer is going to have more severe damages on it. The land way out on the edges that's only going to be, pick a number, 6 inches, a foot, not flooded, whatever, is going to have a lower set of damages.
Okay. Because one of the things I look back at Western Cass flood study that was completed here not too long ago, but I know when our engineers got involved in that, there was a lot of controversy about, well, no, we were actually there and the water went here, didn't go here, and I know the technology is improving all the time, but landowners know their land better than anyone else, and I just think we need to be prepared for that and make sure that we've got our numbers as accurate as possible.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, Mary, that we're using a hydraulic model to simulate what will happen if the project is built and if this certain flood event does occur. And so all of those things are, while the modeling is really robust and very capable, it's based on a hypothetical situation that may occur or may not occur. And so getting property owners to understand that in itself is going to be a challenge. And, having the appraisal expertise to try to, assimilate that information into a meaningful value reduction or payment is going to be a challenge as well. But, that is something that really gets taken into account into the after condition. And you've got a boatload of data that we think will be helpful.
I'd like to ask you a question. This information is good. It's solid. There's a lot of appraisal methodology and technology that has gone into this, and we've got, like Eric said, boatloads of data. It's going to be very difficult for anybody to disprove it. Having said that, it's good data, but it's written in appraiser speak. So, my question is marketing. Here's my idea. I would love to have a scale model of this pool area or staging area be made that has the right elevations in it, and then have it a working model so that you could pour water in at the south, it would go up there, and then you would add a certain amount of water to it to show where the water is going to flow given these various 5, 10, 20-year events. That would be a show and tell.
Well, how is that different from now? You can go to the City of Fargo's website and look up your flood risk and put in a 36-foot flood and see where it hits your yard. And it's really cool. But yeah, something like that would be really nice to expand that out. And I think it's pretty accurate. Mm-hmm. But then every event is different. But does anyone have any other questions for these gentlemen?
I have one question. You have a rating of 7 to 35. The other one. Yep. Would you assume that there would be some outside of those? My question is frequency of the deepest and the longest. When I look at it, I don't think, to me, I was a farmer, and it's ground right next to the lake. Looking at how many times it's come value of my land, to me doesn't help convince me that it is. And why the 35%, or actually the flood risk is, the actual flood. I don't think that's
Okay. Based on what?
based on frequency.
The, as I mentioned, we're going to be assigning, calculating, whatever word you want to use, the frequency, the duration, and the depth of any individual piece of ground. And the more, the deeper, the longer it's flooded, the more frequently, the higher the range is going to be. Now, to your point, we saw in some of the matched pairs that we did, we saw damages up to 40 and 45%. So could it, of value, yeah. So could it be higher than 35%? In some cases it is, but for every matched pair that we have that's out in that range, we also have another set or more sets that are lower than that. And so we had to try to rein in those outliers and bring it into a range that is probable. Yeah. But anytime you get involved in something like this, you know you're going to be wrong.
Yeah, go ahead. Would you step up to the microphone, please?
Hi, you guys know me, I'm Joe. So Roger, that is a good question. And the model that was built in this phase one part of the study is all sorts of formulas and relationships between these different variables, one of which is frequency. So with the base model built, if when the hydraulic model is completed or meteorological conditions change or the meteorological outlook changes and frequency appears to be more, you have this set of variables in a complex relationship that you could actually change. So, okay, what if we're wrong? What if it's going to flood every other year? Or if the duration is longer? But the cool thing about phase one is that it's a model built on actual data. And this is what the market has said in Northern Valley, Southern Valley, down at Birds Point, New Madrid. And so now that we have that model built, we can adjust based on what we think is going to happen. That may not convince you that it's a fair payment, but the data itself is what it is, essentially. We can adjust the variables from there, or the correlation or the strength of each, but the model itself really wouldn't change that much.
I've got a couple more questions, but I'm going to save it for just 5 minutes.
And we're delving into phase two questions right now.
Yeah,
So-
maybe I'll just wrap up a few slides here. I know we're getting close on time. I did want to touch on cost, and so obviously that's a question that many of you may have. We recently, or the Diversion Authority recently produced a new cost estimate for the project. One of the points I wanted to make is that the findings from phase one are consistent with the budget assumptions that were incorporated into the recently produced cost estimate. And so they're not spot on, but I guess I'm confident that the assumptions we made were consistent with what the findings were. So that's maybe a little bit of sigh of relief for some of you. Then just to touch on the next steps, obviously we're still anxious about the permit review process. If, assuming that goes positively, we do anticipate working with Crown to identify the scope of work for phase two and want to initiate that study relatively quickly. They have some work that they can do to determine the current value of all the farmlands that will be impacted, sort of the before value. But there's also the need to get the hydraulic model finalized, and that's, I guess, typically done through FEMA's CLOMER process, or conditional letter of map revision. And so that process, the FEMA review and the CLOMR process, is going to take several months. And so the Phase 2 effort won't really be able to be started in complete earnest until we get through that FEMA approval step. In the meantime, NDSU has done their ag study based on Plan A, and now I think it's going to be really important for us to have that updated based on Plan B. If you recall, one of the major changes of Plan B was to reduce the frequency of operation from once every 10 years to roughly once every 20 years by allowing more water to flow through the metro. And then ultimately, Phase 2 will produce the value of easements for all of the specific ag land parcels that are impacted by the project. And so I'm anticipating that's going to take the bulk of 2019, if not it entirely. And then hopefully in 2020, we'll be at a position where we can start actually presenting offers to property owners for the purchase of their flowage easements. That was all we had for today, but I know these guys are available for questions and certainly welcome any myself.
Eric, do you have plans to gear up the Ag Committee again and present this to them? I think that would be timely.
Yeah, if Roger gets done farming, we'll do that immediately.
Well, I appreciate your questions, Roger. I think it's just important to get people on the front end of things rather than waiting until it's all wrapped up and then have a bunch of questions about how you got to the point we did, so.
Eric and I have had that discussion as well, that we should bring them together.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Any other questions on this? Yes, Bob?
Just a comment, I think maybe goes to Roger's question. There's, from what I could gather from the study, there's a lot of cool stuff in there about like value in relation to drainage and things that people like you would really appreciate. And obviously we didn't talk about that today, but in your ag group, some of that I think may lend some real credibility to the flowage valuation, flowage easement valuation portion of this, relative to things people are more familiar with.
Great. Anything else on that? Okay, then, Eric, do you want to talk about the acquisition process update?
Yeah, in your packet, there's a couple page handout related to Quick Take, and I don't want the discussion here to focus only on Quick Take, but I felt like this was important to share with the group. On Monday of this week, a few of us went to the Cass County Commission and gave a brief presentation about acquisition process, and in particular, addressed the relatively new quick take legislation that the Water Resource District will have to follow for the project. This legislation was approved in 2017, and so it's largely untested, but yet it does provide very specific steps, somewhat like a recipe. And so in the past, the use of quick take has been very few. I think we've acquired about 200 parcels of land so far for the project, and we've had to resort to court action on 5 of those, all of which have been settled before the court process worked its way out. But that being said, moving forward, our certain goal is to not use court action. That's definitely something we don't want to do, but in the event we have to adhere to a timeline, the quick take process does provide an ability to have date certain on when we can access the land. And so the property owner still can argue over value, and that court process about value goes on, but the quick take procedures in North Dakota provide the project the opportunity to actually access the property. And so it's an important tool, especially as we think about wanting to authorize the P3 developers eventually to use the land. And so this process here just has some very prescriptive steps. One of them includes going to the county commission and basically asking the county commission if you know, for their authorization for the water district to use quick take, that request or involvement of the county commission is new per the 2017 legislation. And so we previewed that with Cass County on Monday of this week, and I guess I felt that given the timing of that and given the timing of this meeting, I just wanted you to have that information for your awareness.
And I want to be real clear here that we're meeting today. We have not met for quite some time, and it was important that we see this work that Crown Appraisals has done, assuming hopefully we'll get a permit sooner rather than later, and lands is something that we can, I think, take off on pretty quickly, and I know we've got a lot of landowners that have a lot of interest in making decisions one way or another, so, and it's always been a question, what's a flowage easement worth? I mean, it's just, it makes people nervous not to have these answers, so the sooner we can provide them, I think, the better public service we're doing. So, and I'm sorry, Roger, I kind of went past the Joint Water Resource District.
And we're just kind of waiting for that permit so we can, go forward.
Okay.
Kind of going over the process of, how we're gonna roll it out.
Okay.
And Dan is here also. Dan?
Who was
Oh,
here?
he was here.
Oh, I saw him.
He's going to finance.
Okay.
Okay.
And then the meetings calendar you've got in your packet there, and, hopefully we can start ramping these up right away. I think that we didn't have much of a turnout today, probably because they're just used to us not meeting now, but we're, once we get going, we're going to have a lot of decisions and recommendations to make, so I hope we get good full participation in this. But we intend to meet, right before finance again and public outreach and kind of make it as simple for everybody as possible. Did you have anything else on that, Eric?
No, I just acknowledge that it's the same sort of cadence or frequency of meetings that have been established for the last year plus, and so the board meetings, I guess, are being proposed as the fourth Thursday, and then the committee meetings are the day prior to that, with the exception of the holiday months, November and December. So.
And I would assume initially that there will be more board meetings than what's on here if there is a permit given?
Yeah, there's been speculation that maybe we need to go back to twice a month. I think maybe a year and a half ago, there was twice a month meetings, and I guess if that requires, then we'll adjust.
And, the policies that are made up front will require us to meet perhaps a little more frequently, but once that gets taken care of, this should be just humming right along, and hopefully we've got everything in place. And I think the mayor's at the wrong meeting, but be really happy when the city of Fargo gets everything moved over next door. Any other business for us? Okay, motion to adjourn, please.
Move adjournment.
Thank you. And a
Second.
second. And we are adjourned. Thanks.